the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, or maybe leave us a nice review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate everybody's help. But today we're pleased to speak with Jason Reed, professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine, whose works include The Micropolitics of Capital, Marx and the Prehistory of the Present, The Politics of Transindividuality, The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy, and today's focus, hot off the Verso presses, The Double Shift, Spinoza and Marx on the Politics of Work. Very excited to dive into some Spinoza and Marx, some of my personal favorite thinkers, so thanks for having me.
It's really nice, Jason. We've been, I guess, loose mutuals on Twitter for a while, social media compatriots in the whatever side of the Twitter sphere we're on, right? the sort of philosophy, politics, whatnot. And I do remember, now this is just off the top of my head before I ask you your origin story question, which I prompted you with, but I do remember, I think it was on a Facebook post where you sort of mentioned that you had some students coming in who had been like listening to theory podcasts, mentioning Acid Horizon, and I think ours as well. And and I suppose you were comparing it to as you were growing up in the sort of in the sphere of philosophy theory and as a student and the different listservs you might be a part of. Am I correctly remembering that kind of idea, and maybe how the scene has changed in the communication of ideas or just that kind of thing?
Yeah, you're correct. I mean, I was thinking about how when I was in like grad school specifically, I spent a lot of time on autopsy, which is like autonomedia, aporismo, and then there's a Deleuze listserv. There are a lot of listservs. And, in some sense, it was, well, first of all, it was a response to the fact that there was a real paucity of sources talking about things like autonomia, and people like Antonio Negri and Tronti and so on. And even, this is going to date me incredibly, it's hard to imagine there once was a poverty of resources on Deleuze. When
I know,
Deleuze
right? It's hard to imagine.
But when there were a handful of books like Masumi's, User's Guide, but only a couple books out there, and there were a lot of people in academia who were coming out of a different, very Heidegger and Derrida dominated tradition, just were not well suited to talk about people like Deleuze. And so you would go online to have discussions about this, because it did sort of break a certain kind of monopoly, I guess, where the professor is the only person you can sort of have any sort of contact with, and you kind of take their word for it. And it was helpful for me to kind of forge my own kind of intellectual trajectory, that I was not confined to the people in my immediate vicinity, because many of the people in my immediate vicinity had no interest or no real background to discuss some of the things I was interested in and talking about. And so I think about this now. I mean, I think constantly about like, how can this moment be used to, like, what does it mean to teach philosophy in a world where the image of the solitary sort of professor in front of the classroom as the only source of information is completely sort of bygone? And the way to make that into a more interesting and provocative space where you have to intersect with different discussions and cannot assume a kind of monopoly as the basis for your their way of talking about philosophy.
I mean, I think that that's really important. You can see they still kind of coincide. Let's say it's sort of that heterogeneity of the present that you discuss in your book, looking at certain thinkers like Laurent. But I'm thinking about this in terms of the internet, right? Where obviously the listservs, and then there was obviously the rise of the blogospheres. Not that they have gone away, and sort of podcasts have sort of kind of been around, but I know that they've taken on a whole new saliency, let's say, even if there had been webinars and things like that. But you can still see, obviously, the blogosphere is still active. I mean, I remember when I was coming up in the sort of mid aughts, that was the medium to be on, and not just to publish, work, but also the lively interaction one would get with readers across. I mean, really, we're not even talking about like ever focusing on one blog, but just there being a sort of confederation of blogs, at least for anyone's particular interests. Obviously, for us, it might be philosophy, but I'm sure that there were plenty of other ones. So it is kind of interesting that whether we can call it, with scare quotes, the democratization of knowledge or something like this, but at least allowing for different forms of participation, different forms of interaction, as you said, that maybe decentralize the traditional academic model that you're discussing. So you gave us a nugget of history, right? Of the listservs being central to your sort of ongoing education. I did want to give you the chance, though, as we always do, to maybe provide us with an insight into how you got into philosophy or decided to take on this daunting role of pursuing graduate research, getting the PhD. And I am curious about how Marx became so central for you, because that could be that could be a side story. It may not be, one and the same thing, but I want to give you space to just tell us maybe a little bit more about your journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, it was a journey in which I was uncertain about whether or not philosophy was the right terrain to sort of explore the questions I was interested in. I mean, I remember taking my first intro to philosophy class, which was heavily on, well, we did Plato and we did social contract theory. And then at the end, because of this was at SUNY Purchase, the professor had us read Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. And to me, social contract theory just seemed like completely disconnected from the reality of any kind of politics, right? It just seemed like a just so story. Interesting to think about, but had nothing to do with. And then the Arendt seemed more engaging. And then I felt like from there, I got interested in people like Foucault. Once again, I was interested in it, but I wasn't sure if it was philosophy because of the role of history and sort of, that kind of element of it. And at the same time, I was involved in sort of anarchist groups that were also interested in reading different kinds of theory. And it wasn't really until I began to encounter people like, for me, a big formative thing was thinking about the relationship between Deleuze and Foucault, especially during the 70s, when they were very much like, we're both doing the same thing, but Foucault was doing it in terms of a history of the prison and history of thinking about sexuality, and Deleuze is doing the same thing, sort of reading Spinoza and reading Nietzsche, this idea that, look, I suddenly began to see like, okay, philosophy creates these sort of concepts, and these concepts can be put to work in these different sort of problems and fields, but you need the concepts. And then I began to think, okay, so the philosophical work is this sort of conceptual work, but at the same time, I was doing all of this, in the US, where there's this huge divide between philosophy departments and theory programs. And for me, it seemed like both offered a chance to study some of the things I wanted to study, but I was very, adamant that a lot of what is called theory in the US is philosophy. These people are trained as philosophers, and the work they do is on philosophy. So I was trying to find a space for that. So that's part of the story. Now, you also asked the Marx part of the story, which I think is also worth, because, Marx too, we're once again dealing with this question of the relationship between philosophy and the outside of philosophy, and this constant debated thing where, often the presentation you get of Marx in philosophy departments is kind of this strange, like, when Marx was philosophical, he wasn't quite Marx, right? Because that's the early, 1844
Right. Okay.
heavily dominated by sort of Hegel and Feuerbach. And when Marx was Marx, Capital, he wasn't really philosophical anymore. But, you sort of, in between, you read the 11th thesis on Feuerbach as sort of this departure, right? Philosophers interpreted the world, point is to change it. I'm leaving philosophy. I'm going to do this critical study of capital, which is something different than philosophy. And then in grad school, I became very convinced that I had to read and wrestle with Capital, which a lot of people treated as something you've either already read or
Right.
and formed a reading group. Once again, talking about what we were saying at the beginning of creating other spaces for the production of knowledge in the classroom, formed a reading group with other graduate students from not just from philosophy, but from sociology, history, literary theory at SUNY Binghamton. And we started to just work through Capital. And then it was in working through Capital that I sort of began to form the ideas for my thesis, which later became my first book, The Micropolitics of Capital, in which I really wanted to challenge the supposed divide that there was this rift between something called Marxism and something called post-structuralism. And either they could be understood as sort of weirdly complementary, like one analyzes the mode of production, the other analyzes the mode of subjection, in the way that sometimes Foucault presents himself as being sort of like, I'm not interested in what Marxists do, but I have this other thing I'm interested in, but they're not opposed. And sometimes they're seen as not complementary, but absolutely oppositional, in that either you understand history in terms of the mode of production and changing economic relations, or you understand history in terms of power relations and the constitution of subjectivity. So that is, what I wanted to do with the first book. And I also wanted to, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, I wanted to overcome this sort of double bind where Marx is philosophical, but not quite Marx, or Marx is Marx, but not quite philosophical, and make the claim that, not like alone in this, this is the same claim that people like Althusser were making, that Capital has to be read as a philosophical text, even if the philosophy has to kind of be brought out from between the lines, and in the way that it thinks through problems of history or problems of the causality underlying social relations, that these are philosophical problems, even if they don't appear with the particular mode of exposition that we think of when we think of philosophy.
I spent a little bit of time glancing through your recent translation, which I didn't add in your bio, but you recently translated, what's the title in English? I know in French, it's, we could roughly translate it as The Production of Men. And maybe that has the word homme in French has its own philosophical history that maybe sounds a little bit weird in English. So it has a different, what's the title?
It's Marx with Spinoza.
Marx.
And then I forget after the colon, it's like alienation, history, subjectivity, I believe.
Okay. But Fishbach has a similar thing where he decries, like, the Pleiad, like, divides up Marx's works into like what's philosophy and what's not. So like this does seem to be a theme, as you said, shared by many authors, that this division between a philosophical Marx and a quote unquote non-philosophical Marx, if not misleading, then perhaps self-defeating, or at least provides certain obstacles that might, I don't know, lead one to sort of mistake what Marx is actually doing in his analyses.
I think there's a sense in which, and it's funny because, in the few, and there's not a lot of references that Marx makes to Spinoza, there's a letter where, and I can't remember the date of the letter, in which Marx says that the challenge of reading someone like Spinoza is a challenge of, basically, the challenge is that Spinoza is saying things that have to be sort of, read between the lines would be the cliched ways of putting it, that there is something more in the exposition of the text than the stated context of the stated manifest content of the text.
Right.
And I feel like in a way in which, like, Marx said that about Spinoza, and to some extent, the same thing could be said about Marx, although
Like Capital Volume 1, for example, and the order in which it
there's a philosophical matter in the choice of beginning with that famous line about the wealth of societies in which capitalism is dominant confronts us an immense accumulation of commodities. Why do we get the commodity at the beginning of Capital Volume 1? And then its exposition, which leads us into the question of the different sides of labor. And then only in the very end of Capital Volume 1 do we get what you'd think you'd get if you're talking about a text that is a historical text, is that the history of capitalism's formation, primitive accumulation, and so on. You'd think if, Marx's point is to think historically, as it in some sense is, you'd begin with, an origin story about,
right.
This is what happened before capitalism. This is how capitalism came into the world. And the very choice to begin with that sort of phenomenological appearance, the world confronts us as a world of commodities. And only then, later, after exploring the relationship of the labor making that appearance possible, do we get the violence that made that labor possible, is itself a philosophical kind of question of presentation.
No, I totally agree with you on that. And there's something similar to, and I know Deleuze says it several different places, but one of the places he says it is in Essays Critical and Clinical, when he thinks about the ethics as these three books. I'm not talking about the parts of the ethics, but like there's a book of water that has to do with the imagination and signs. There's this book of fire that's made up of the scholia and the appendices, and then there's this aerial book, this book of air, that really is the fifth part where everything accelerates. And so one could be maybe seduced, if you will, by the geometrical method of the ethics and maybe not see some of the subterranean currents going on throughout that work, and just maybe be misled by the edifice, the structure, rather than the incredibly intricate network that's formed. I know that people have diagrammed this. Maybe like Matheron has this crazy diagram, like linking every definition and scholium to every proposition and whatnot. So you could be misled by, so to speak, the simplicity of the rhetoric or lack thereof, to not see the intricacy. And so I agree with you about this question of maybe Marx is thinking about the organization of Capital Volume 1 and the reasons for choosing to present in such a way. I know people have written about it extensively, but it's always been a fascinating topic.
I mean, this is something I think that in a weird way, Deleuze and Althusser have in common, is this idea that there is to read a philosophical text is not to break it down to a series of sort of sound bites, right? This is the thing that Althusser really did not like about what was happening to Marx philosophically, and continues to happen to Marx philosophically. People pull a passage here or there, a definition of ideology here, a base superstructure here, and use those few passages as the summation of the entire philosophical content. And that for Althusser, you have to think not the philosophical content in a few phrases that sound philosophical, but in the relation that's being developed and articulated. In the same way, I mean, Deleuze did the same thing with his book on Spinoza, right? He admits Spinoza doesn't talk about expression that much. That if there is a philosophy of expression in Spinoza, it's to some extent immanent throughout the entire text. In a similar way, I think that, Spinoza is one of those thinkers, if you just fixate on the content of this or that proposition, it's never going to seem that engaging. It can seem very dry. It can seem the philosophical work is in the relations between the propositions and what they make possible. And in a similar way, you could say that what Althusser is saying about capital, Deleuze is saying about Spinoza, but it is a different kind of labor of reading, in which it is not a matter of just finding this or that passage that says something, but thinking what is said between and through the relations of the different theses or propositions, whatever you want to call them.
I mean, that seems like dialectics 101. I mean, not to dumb down what you just said, I'm just thinking about how certain passages or even statements of Marx could be sloganized and then weaponized in a way that would defeat any sort of space for thinking a little bit more critically. It can sort of tamper down discussion or a wider understanding as though we're common sense or something like this.
Yeah.
I do want to give one last space for an origin story, and that is the topic of today's discussion, the double shift. Spinoza and Marx, the chronology there it's not on the concept of work. I'm messing up
politics of work.
On the politics of work. Thank you. I had philosophy on the brain, so that's my fault. I'm thinking about what I'm wondering is, where did this genesis for the idea for this book coalesce? I mean, obviously you could think that you've been thinking about Marx since your thesis, but I was wondering about your translation, right, which does bear the title, as you mentioned, Marx with Spinoza, of Fischbach, which I think just came out last year. But I was also wondering if perhaps some of this was already taking shape in the Politics of Transindividuality. I'm thinking about how centrally important to your work is this discussion of the affective dimension, which I suppose would be the Spinozist aspect, or more prominently so. So I did want to give you the space maybe to tell us a little bit about how this idea for the book came about.
I mean, I guess one thing I should say that's kind of not included in your list of things, which are all part of the formation of the problem, the Transindividuality book, the translation, and there was, a period in which it almost seems bizarre to remember now, but there's a period, especially during the height of COVID sort of restrictions and lockdown, where all I did was work on the book and work on the translation. Like, I sort of worked myself through the period and would do one during the day and one during the night on top of each other. But I mean, another provocation for the
that's book. The first double shift in. That's the first double shift, is working on these two things simultaneously. Okay.
And another double shift would be the fact that I've been teaching a class on the politics of work here at the University of Southern Maine for almost over 10 years. And really wanting to write something about work and our attachment to it. And then in the midst of all of this, it just sort of occurred to me that, because I did think for a while that I could or would want to do a more generic sort of Marx and Spinoza book. But I think it was maybe because I felt like Fischbach had done that so well, and because I thought that there's a certain part of me which feels like at a certain point, it's one thing to say, thinking about these two thinkers is really useful and productive, and just leave it at that, right? Say but to me, it's wouldn't that statement be much more interesting if you actually sort of showed how they can be productive in relationship to a specific problem or situation, rather than make the argument sort of in the abstract? And so I thought that maybe instead of writing a kind of here's why it's useful to think about Spinoza and Marx in general, maybe I would write it in terms of a specific problem. And of course, going back to what we were talking about earlier, there's also this lingering, for years I've done this blog where I would talk about, TV shows and movies as well as philosophy. I mean, it's a very weird blog because 1 week it'll be like a review of some Spinoza book that's only in French, and the next week it'll be like, oh, Snowpiercer. And I don't really know, in some sense, that's the liberty of having something like a blog, is that any editor, anyone trying to concern with building an audience would say maybe don't randomly go from Planet of the Apes movies to this book which no one has heard about. But people kept saying to me, you should do something with your discussion of movies and TV.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay. And there's always this question for me, okay, were these two separate books? Because I did at one point have this idea that thinking about especially the so-called golden age of whatever you call it, peak TV,
Hmm.
how many of the TV series were like, all of them were about work in one way or another, right? They were about a certain kind of, decline of a certain idea of work, right? The famous line from The Sopranos, like, I feel like I got in the tail end of something, right? The sort of decline of a certain kind of masculinity made possible by a certain kind of work, or the line from The Wire, right? We used to make something in this country, now we just have our hands in each other's pockets. And they're about a certain decline of work, but they're also at the same time, they're about people who are incredibly driven by their work. I mean, the clearest example, and this is one of the ones I do talk about in the book, is Breaking Bad, which is both about the failure of work to produce what it's supposed to produce, right? Security and stability for your family. The show begins quite famously with a high school chemistry teacher coming to the realization that his cancer diagnosis might leave his family destitute. And his desperate attempt to come up with a solution, which is cooking meth, even though it's about sort of the failure of work to provide security and stability, it's also about, at the same time, a certain ideal or even ideological dimension of work that if you are good enough at your job and you work hard enough, you can produce the very stability and security that work denies, right? You could become, your own boss, right? Literally, you blow your boss up. And so I thought about doing that separately, but then at some point it seemed like it would be useful to connect the theory and the cultural analysis and make them part of the same book. Although how so was something I worked on for a long time. I mean, because I do think that, I am part of the reason you have something like a blog, or part of the reason you, and I'm sure you guys have thoughts too, do something like a podcast, is you are trying to reach other sorts of audiences. And, I mean, one of the things, as someone who teaches in an undergraduate institution, teaches philosophy, I sometimes have these conversations with students where, like, they don't really want to go to graduate school because they know that it might not be the right thing, that the prospects of jobs are dismal and so on, but they don't want their intellectual life to end. Yeah. And they can't imagine an intellectual life outside of the university, right? I mean, I think this is one of the real downsides of a kind of monopoly on intellectual life that the university inhabits, is that people cannot imagine thinking outside of the university. And so they stick to the university, even as the university really fails to provide for the conditions of that thinking. And so producing other spaces and other types of thinking, and with that, other types of writing, so that you can connect these concepts to things that people might be more familiar with, to make the concepts seem more viable, more visible, and more worth the work of actually, doing the work. In some sense, the book itself, The Double Shift, is also kind of written in a double shift between my life as a teacher and my life as a writer and thinker, and another double shift, my life as a writer and thinker in the spaces of academia, writing journal articles and that sort of thing, and my life as a writer and thinker outside the spaces of academia and blog posts and so on, and trying to do a kind of double shift between those two. I'm four now, but between those different spaces. Sorry, once you start thinking about double shifts, you can just put them everywhere.
No, I love it.
Math really adds up. So, and thinking between those different spaces.
That's great, because that was one of the questions that I didn't ask explicitly, because I know that you had a short interview, or maybe it was excerpts from an interview. I'm not sure was it done through someone from Verso or representing Verso, or was it, obviously we can link it. You posted it in the past week, but one of the questions was about the role of these cultural blockbusters that are widely appreciated and consumed, like Breaking Bad, Office Space maybe reaches back a little bit further, but it still, I think, has some staying power, and Fight Club. But also, gosh, there was Better Call Saul and whatnot. And so you kind of anticipated one of the questions I didn't include by weaving in, it is interesting, as you're saying on your blog, Unemployed Negativity, you're able to go from, most of these books are dense books on Spinoza and French, to, a quote unquote cultural analysis. But I think it does, interestingly, the fact that you kept that material in, I think is nice, because it wraps back around to what we were talking about, trying to separate sort of the philosophical Marx from the cultural critic, sociologist Marx, and being able to interweave those two and show the life of concepts in literary works, broadly speaking, I think it does a service. Coop, were you going to add something, brother?
I was just going to go back to, Jason mentioned that you were involved in some kind of anarchist groups. I was just curious if you had engaged much with Stirner's work, because I feel like he's somewhat of a specter in the background of some of this discussion, I think, particularly, and we don't have to get into this now, but I do want to discuss this a little bit with this abstract labor, abstract humanity. But this was kind of more of just a general question, because I think, that was kind of the interesting little connection I was making with my own interests that I can, we can push off to towards the end of the discussion, but just kind of a general question.
Actually, in the anarchist groups or reading groups that I was involved in, that never really came up. But the weird thing about the anarchist groups, and I have no idea why this was the case, for some reason, even though there was, as there often is in some anarchist groups, a kind of strange, misplaced, anachronistic hostility to Marx, which seems like some people are trying to relive sort of like the 19th or early 20th century. There was, in one of the groups I was involved in, they were very interested in the situationists, even though the strangest thing about this is that then you get to reading something like De Boer's Society of the Spectacle, and you're like, you guys know this is like, he's directly cribbing some lines from Marx, not only from Marx, but then like some of the lines are cribbed through someone like Lukács. This is pretty heavy Marxist sort of stuff. I mean, I understand that somehow the Situationists, being the kind of group they were and the kind of thing people think about them politically, means this is acceptable. But it's a weird thing to say, but going back into the reading Marx story, it's like one of the things that got me really interested in reading Marx was reading the Situationists. And even though the Situationists were presented to me as anarchist thinkers, it was their engagement with Marx that, and then like around the time, like, another formative thing, this is going back into there's kind of a weird media history discussion in the middle of all this, because we go podcast to blogs and blogs back to zines. And you have zines like Against Sleep and Nightmare and other zines that were heavily influenced by the Situationists. And, that strange way in which zine writing and theory writing sort of intersect.
I'm glad, Coop, you brought up Stirner. I know Stirner gets name dropped in the book, but it's in relation to sort of Marx's corrective on it. And I know Marx writes, I guess, extensively about, lovingly called, Saint Max in the German ideology, right? I guess I would ask one last question about the double shift. You named a few of them in the composition of the book and in the content and the form of it, so to speak. And I was wondering too, it seems as though, and I think you worked this out of the introduction, correct me if I'm wrong, but that each chapter is focused on conceptual double shifts, right? The economic and the political, we could say the mental and the physical, or the doing and thinking, and then action and production. I was wondering if was that an aha moment that you had early on, or did that work itself out during the composition that, these conceptual double shifts are going on, and I need to bring that out?
That's an interesting question. I think the first one that sort of paved the way for the others is this. In the book, I quote this. It's this bizarre passage from Marx. It's from volume 3 of Capital, where he talks about the. You guys mind if I read it?
Please do.
So he says the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship of domination and servitude, as this grows directly out of production itself and reacts back on its turn as a determinant. It is in each case the direct relationship of the owners of production to the immediate producers, a relationship whose particular form naturally corresponds always to a certain level of development of the type and manner of labor, and hence to its social productive power, in which we find the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social edifice, and hence also the political form of the relationship of sovereignty and dependence. In short, the specific form of the state in each case. So I guess the first double shift is the double shift of the economic into the political, right? That work is immediately political. And at one point this is probably not that interesting to talk about different ideas of conception of book. I wanted to call them short circuits.
Okay, yeah.
Because similar kind of thing about the relationship between two spheres, which are often held to be in some sense separate, but are considered to be, but I want to consider them to be interrelated or two different expressions of the same thing. And for me, one of the things that really interests me about thinking about work is the way in which work is, in some sense directly political. I'm always fascinated. I mean, if one wanted a very immediate reaction to this, the sort of joke, pithy version of this is you don't have to stand outside of a protest for too long or be in a protest for too long to hear someone yell, "Get a job." Or
Right.
get a real
Okay.
job.
Yeah, that's funny.
And in fact, I just saw the other day, I happened to foolishly weigh in on the treatment of the protesters at Emory as the police stormed the campus. And one of my posts on the site formerly known as Twitter went sort of, big, not big, but, had numbers. And I scrolled down the things and eventually got to someone telling me to get a real job.
Was this someone who pays for Twitter, by the way? That it feels like
possibly,
it feels like a blue check would have said it, but go on.
But so, there's a way in which our ideas about work shape and inform our ideas about social order and social hierarchy, that work is immediately and directly political. And then once I started thinking along those lines, one of the things that I really wanted to do with the book is, on some level, it is an attempt to rethink what's at stake in a concept of ideology. And especially along those lines of trying to overcome a certain kind of way of thinking about ideology in which, ideology is part of a superstructure that's separate from a base, that the base itself is defined by a certain kind of mute compulsion, or that economic relations just have a certain kind of necessity that doesn't have any kind of representational or articulation other than their own necessity, right? This is sort of there's this sort of back and forth, right, within a kind of Marxist theory. Why do people go to work every day? Why do people, to take the classic sort of Marx question by way of Deleuze-Guattari, why do people work rather than go on strike every day? The two ways of responding to that, one way is to respond to that by simply saying, well, given the destruction of anything like a commons, given the destruction of anything like non-commodified ways of reproducing one's existence, it's pretty much work or starve. It's not any more complicated than that. It's a direct expression of the economic relations. So that's the base answer. And then there's the other answer, which would be the more superstructure answer, the way in which work is sold to us as something meaningful that gives us purpose, that defines who we are. And to me, both of those answers obviously seem necessary, but it also seems necessary to overcome the division between the two of them and to think the way in which, what is economic is immediately or does double work as ideological, and what is ideological does double work as economic, right? Or, one way to think about this is like when people ask the question, as people often do, what do you do for a living? It's a question both. I mean, oddly, I think when people hear that question, they hear two things at once. They hear one is, who are you? What do you want to be? What do you try? Like it responds to a certain idea of choice and decision and self-definition. But then the other part of it is who are you understood not in terms of what do you want to be, but where are you in the economic hierarchy? How important are you? How powerful are you, etc. So that it says two things at once to some extent shows this double shift. And I think that, one of the things that I wanted to think about, going back to this thinking about ideology, is that it seems to me that ideology has both the term that someone like Althusser would use is a spontaneous ideology, right? The way in which a given practice, without needing any kind of articulation or development, produces its own way of thinking. Going to work every day, the common sort of spontaneous ideology of this is making a living. It's ideological because you're not directly making a living, not directly producing or reproducing the things necessary to your existence. You could be producing something very far from not only your existence, but the existence of anyone, really. But the fact that it is presented as producing or reproducing your existence is a kind of spontaneous ideology, right, that emerges from work itself. But at the same time, right, when it comes to work, there's not just a spontaneous ideology, which produces work as itself an anthropological constant, a necessity. We all have to do stuff in order to survive. There is on top of that a more explicit or articulated ideology, which defines work as something which makes us worthwhile, gives us meaning, and so on. And that in order to think about work, it's constantly thinking about the spontaneity and the articulation of the two things. And I think to some extent, this is, when Althusser formulates them, I know it comes in part from Lenin, but Althusser was always kind of translating sort of Lenin through things like Spinoza, that, for Althusser, to some extent, the very idea of these two levels of ideology, a spontaneous and a more articulated, comes from Spinoza's distinction between prejudice and superstition, right? Because Spinoza says, quite famously in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics, that we're all born ignorant of the causes of things and conscious of our desires. That's the kind of basic human condition. And because of this ignorance of the causes of things, and because we're aware of our desires, we often make sense of the world through our desires, right? If something hinders our desires, it's bad. If it helps our desires, it's good. But then Spinoza says at some point, this sort of spontaneous way of making sense of the world through our desires becomes an official kind of superstition once it's articulated and used to make sense of the world, right? And so this idea that one has to think both the immediate structural conditions and the more sort of developed, articulated conditions together is something that I think comes through Spinoza and comes through Marx as well, and creates strange, because there are different thinkers are better at worse at different aspects. Like I think someone like Frederick Lardon is really good at talking about the way in which the wage relation is a reprogramming of desire, right? I think one of the things that Lardon is really good at, especially the fact he comes from economics, is, the classic definition that people give of capitalism. Why does capitalism work? What does it do? Is usually this idea of it's a system predicated on self-interest. And one of the things that Lardon says is, well, that's not really true, because it's actually pretty far from self-interest to show up every day at a place, work your hours, and so on. That if self-interest would be really just grabbing what you want when you want, that would be, if you want to say, immediate self-interest. So it, in some sense, is a structuring of self-interest, right? A structuring of self-interest through the wage relation. And I think that one of the things that Lardon is very smart about is that, given Spinoza's assertion on the importance of desire desire being the essence of humanity, but an essence which is always determined by a particular affect, that to some extent, desire is always structured. And in the sense that every society is going to say in some way, shape, or form, this is what you need to do to realize your desires. And there'll be different definitions of what that is, but to some extent, every society is a structuring of desire, and every society is structured by desire. And you can understand, you can think back, even think about this as sort of biographically, that like to some extent, this may be a little bit like a very suburban middle-class bourgeois version of it, but like, what is getting an allowance but a lesson in the structuring of desire? It says, do these things, you get this money, the money, you can buy the stuff you want, and it begins to kind of create this connection between doing labor and realizing one's desire. And of course, that connection can be articulated in many different ways. One of the things that Don points out is that it's a different capitalism, the capitalism in which sort of early stages in which the main thing you're doing is working so as not to starve or be out on the street, to a capitalism which you are working because, you really want to get that boat. These are different formations. But, Laudon really focuses on the immediate economic relation as structuring of desire. But I think that to some extent, we have to think about the way in which that immediate relation is also mediated through, goes back to my interest in popular culture, right? Popular culture's tendency to return to work as a way to understand one's place in the world. And I think one of the interesting things, to go back to the Breaking Bad example, because we already talked about it, one of the, I think, truly interesting things about Breaking Bad is that, if you read Vince Gilligan, the show creator's discussion of what he wanted to do with the show, he says what he wanted to do was this Mr. Chips becomes Scarface, right? He wanted a story where someone who's a nice, well-meaning chemistry teacher becomes the villain, and wanted to see what would happen as that happened. But I think the interesting thing about that is that I don't think that's the way the show is read by a lot of its audience.
No.
And the way that Heisenberg became kind of a strange folk hero has everything to do with work, right? Everything to do with the dream that if you work hard enough and you
hustle.
Yeah, that you would become master of your own domain. And of course, it's tied into the way in which it's also like there's a gender politics in that show too, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's a racial politics too, right? And I think the show, to give the show credit, I think they felt incredibly ambivalent about especially their racial politics. But I think that's why they later made neo-Nazis the villains, because they at least recognized that they didn't want to totally go along that direction. But yeah.
And I saw this, not to go outside of the scope, just sticking with Breaking Bad. I think it was, and you see these on Twitter sometimes, or you see these aggregated on, it's clickbait, but it's like the top 10 most hated characters in popular culture. And I know that Skylar, Walter White's wife, is, if not number one, like up there. And I think that says a lot about how you're saying there's this misperception about what the show is trying to do, where Skylar is seen as like the nagging, hateful wife who's really just impeding Walter's desire or something. I think that's a kind of mystification, a kind of, if you will, inversion of what actually is going on in the show. And it shows a way in which there is this identification with Walter White, where we're kind of, even as he's doing these increasingly shady, immoral, devious things, we kind of still are rooting for him. That's part of the gender politics that perhaps, I'm not saying the show could have done a better job of like making it clear that Skylar's not the one in the wrong. I don't think it's necessarily the show's fault that is one of the reasons for which she's placed so highly as, I don't know if I think it's like disliked characters, maybe not hated. Maybe hated was too strong. I'm not exactly sure who knows how the poll was structured.
Yeah, well,
maybe
the heyday of the show, she wrote an opinion column for the New York Times. But I have a character issue about the actress, Anna Gunn, who played Skylar, wrote a piece. To have the hatred for a fictional character get to that level of attention is a strange sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about the gendered mediation of work. And the show, on the one hand, was very clear about, right? Because at one point, over the course of the show, when he's making his money from crystal meth, and of course, when you make money from an illegal enterprise, you have to deal with how you're going to launder or make that money. And because the main character, Walter White, has cancer, and his son sets up the equivalent of a kind of a GoFundMe for his cancer.
Right.
Saul Goodman, the lawyer, says, this is perfect. We can make all the money you made through the drug trade look like a bunch of tiny little donations and launder it through. And the Walter White character is kind of enraged because he wants
credit to a certain extent.
Right.
There's a weird kind of alienation from his labor thing going on, right? It's what you describe in focusing on the ethic or motivation for work and the alienation involved in that same work. That's part of the double shift, but please go on.
Exactly. He wants both the money, but he also wants the recognition, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that Hegel was actually very astute about in his own strange way, right? When Hegel, in the Philosophy of Right, talks about, so I think one of the misconceptions, thinking about the Marx-Hegel relation, is this strange idea that like Hegel was completely detached from any engagement with historical reality, and that Marx, brings the dialectic down to reality. Like Hegel was not unaware of what, he too read Political Economy, he read Adam Smith, and he, in his own way, was aware of at least one of the contradictions of capitalism, and the contradiction has to do with capitalism produces an entirely new form of surplus population, not just people who can't be fed because you're not producing enough food, but people who cannot be employed because they have, and here Hegel gets this directly from Adam Smith, because they've specialized in one particular type of labor, and now that labor is being mechanized or automated in some way, they are no longer needed. And as Hegel says, this leads to a contradiction where, on the one hand, you could give these people the food and shelter they require, but without work, in which case the problem is they'll get the economic value of work, but not its ethical value. They won't be made discipline, right? Because Hegel talks about how like work sands off the rough edges of particularity, that the most important thing you learn in coming to work every day is you become, in some sense, reliable, dependable. It's sort of it's the antechamber of the citizen, right? You have to become a worker before you become a citizen. It makes you dependable, reliable. It teaches you how to deal with others, right? This is, in some sense, Hegel's explanation of why, wealthy people are such weirdos, because they don't have to deal with work. So you can't give people the economic dimension without the ethical dimension. And at the same time, you cannot just give them work because...
bullshit jobs, right? Like do nothing.
Or if you give them meaningful jobs, they will outcompete. This is one of the things, and Robert Castell talks about this in his History of Social Welfare, and Foucault talks about this briefly too in his book on Madness, that as soon as you set up workhouses, then the other people who produce whatever the workhouses will produce will be like, I can't compete with these people. You're putting us out of business. So, of course, Hegel's solution ultimately is, and this is where Hegel's like different from Marx, saw a contradiction, and his solution was, colonialism. Send the people and products to other countries. But, I mean, I think to some extent, what you see in something like Breaking Bad is a restaging of exactly the division that Hegel charted, that work is both something which provides economic goods, produces the things we need to survive, but it also has this kind of ethical dimension, that it produces the kind of people who can interact with other people and the kind of people who have, I think Hegel calls it like self-regard at some point. As in the case of Breaking Bad, if you separate one from the other, if you separate just the money without the self-regard, it is seen as challenging or threatening. Although I think it's seen as challenging or threatening to a...
He's supposed to be the patriarch, right? He's supposed... That brings back in this question of this gender division and this. He worked for all this money with the sweat of his brow, but because he sees himself as a provider, as you already said, he theoretically, at least, this whole story begins with trying to be the provider even after he's gone, which itself would be a monument and a testament to his abilities. It's all interconnected. Yeah. I guess as an excursus, we can always come back to Breaking Bad because you have this line later in the book that crime is work, and I really like that, and it nicely encapsulates some of what we were talking about, because I know a little piece I translated by Leotard, he talks about what he calls black labor. I've never seen the phrase outside, but I assume obviously he's talking about the type of labor done in a kind of black market that might be underboard the typical means of the more licit means of reproducing one's existence. But citing that for a minute, I do like, and because this is going back to a couple of things you said previously, but you do bring up this notion, and I think that you've articulated already how desire is part of the infrastructure, specifically through your discussion of Spinoza. And I only wanted to give a chance. This isn't meant to be like a gotcha question. This is just something that has always fascinated me. With Deleuze and Guattari, you already see intimations of it in Anti-Oedipus, which you mentioned earlier. I actually cribbed the quote where they attribute it to Reich. Why is it that people who steal bread every now and then to feed themselves aren't doing this as a regular practice? Why are the exploited not out, striking every day, as you mentioned? But I'm wondering about their push, which starts in Anti-Oedipus and is like clearly stated on the second page of A Thousand Plateaus, about this, and I've tried to talk with Coop about this. I know, Coop, we've talked about this question about ideology and them saying there is no ideology and never has been. Now, the short version of this, for listeners who maybe haven't heard us briefly talk about it, is that it maybe seems like a conceptual argument that it's on the level of a concept. Ideology perhaps addresses a false problem or whatnot, or isn't a sufficiently elaborate tool to perhaps discuss, again, this basic proposition that desire is part of the infrastructure. But I wanted to know if you had, whether it be in maybe your reading groups or if you had thought about this question and whether or not obviously you discuss ideology in concrete ways throughout your book, but I just wanted to know if you had any reactions, any feelings about this argument that they seem to want to stick to, and whether or not maybe it's for their analysis. They seem to be making a universal claim, though. Again, it's kind of a side quest we can go on, and I wanted to see your thoughts.
I want to approach this two different ways.
Okay.
The first way is, one of the things they say when they're saying this is an Anti-Oedipus, not A Thousand Plateaus, about ideology, or one of the claims they make, which is, I think, connected to this, is they return to Wilhelm Reich again, and they say the masses were not deceived. They actually wanted fascism. And to some extent, the Reich, I think, and one of the strange things about Anti-Oedipus is that Spinoza doesn't come up a lot in it.
No, he doesn't. He's everywhere, it seems, but he explicitly doesn't come up. Right.
And one of the only place he comes up explicitly is, when they say this is why the central political question is the same question that Spinoza asked: why do people fight for servitude as if it was salvation? And then they kind of tie in Spinoza to Reich, to the mass psychology of fascism, and say, the real question is not why do people go on strike or why do people steal, but why aren't people always on strike? Why are people not always stealing, right? And I do think that part of Deleuze and Guattari's rejection of ideology seems to tie in this idea that the masses are not deceived and to think things through desire. And on that point, I think that they're kind of rejecting a very intellectual or intellectualist understanding of ideology as sort of incorrect ideas. Because I think one of the important things of Spinoza's, why do the masses fight for servitude for salvation, is, and where it stands apart from other sort of proto-formulations of ideology. And by proto, I just mean like before Marx and and it's really only after Marx that ideology becomes a specific kind of sort of problem. Of course, as we all know, Marx only said a very little about it, and that very little wasn't even published while he was still alive, in the German ideology.
Yeah, you seem to point out that maybe he was a little bit reticent or a little bit wary about it as a concept itself, but I don't mean to interrupt you.
So I think one of the things about Spinoza's definition is that it stresses that this is not about sort of deception or the passive kind of indoctrination into ideas. This is about a passionate kind of engagement. The masses really wanted fascism. And I think that on that point, I do think that I'm in complete agreement with Deleuze and Guattari that if by ideology you just mean sort of a false representation of reality and not something that encompasses desire in the affects, then the concept is fairly limited in its usefulness. Now, I think there's a second part about Deleuze and Guattari's engagement with ideology that I'm more critical of. And this ties into what I was saying, in some sense, part of this whole notion of a double shift. And that is, Deleuze and Guattari, they make a different distinction. I'm going to try to spell this out quickly as possible because it's pretty dense. About capitalism functioning based on axioms versus other societies functioning based on code. And that a code is on some level supposed to have some kind of meaning or narrative basis to it, right? A code is, if you think about this as a as kind of passing through, as it does in Deleuze and Guattari, sort of theories of anthropology, that a code on the one hand establishes, what is permissible, tolerated, desirable, but it does so in the form of, well, the one thing Deleuze and Guattari say, and this is also tying in with Marx and with Althusser and Balibar and Marx, that the code always has an extra economic relation, right? Because this is tied back to Marx's own idea that even though the economy is determinate, the mode of production, the economic relations are determinate, they're not always dominant. And you get the strange thing where, for huge swaths of human history, like I think Marx says it's about the Middle Ages, everything seemed as if it was all about religion. Religion was dominant, but religion's position of dominance was in some sense determined by the economic relations, right? So, but a code is, I think, something that always passes through some narration or some meaning, right? It says, we do this, we do not do this. Versus an axiom, which, as the term axiom suggests, an axiom, once it is set up, it simply is, right? So an axiom, for example, an axiom is an economic thing, like in terms of like, this is how much a wage is set. There's no rationale. No one says like you're getting paid less because your work is, and people might after the fact come up with rationalizations or justifications, but the axiom just exists as a relation between two different flows, those are what I would say, the labor and money, and it simply just is. It doesn't need an explanation, doesn't offer an explanation. And then tied into this, Deleuze and Guattari argue that, capitalist society is one of massive decoding, right? It doesn't care about the meaning or value of commodities. One way to think about this is just, think about the way in which, if you go to some like new age store, the way in which all the traditions and beliefs of all of humanity have been rendered into commodities, which are relatively interchangeable. You can spend $20, you can get a dream catcher, you can get a Buddha. They're both equally interchangeable. And the entire history of traditions behind them is equally been sort of decoded or stripped into these fundamental axioms.
Yeah, the motley coexistence of everything. Yeah.
But then Deleuze and Guattari argue that in capitalism, it's a massive decoding, but there's a kind of recoding, or that people begin to create new values, but they consider these values to be primarily private. Like this is the importance of the family and their critique of the family and Anti-Oedipus. But they also mention they might have like they might be sort of like some version of an ethnicity or some version of a tradition which is revitalized. And you can see, and here's an aside, one of the things that first drew me to Anti-Oedipus when I read it long, long ago is, even though I didn't understand a lot of the references and I didn't understand a lot of the politics that were coming out of, I felt like I was reading a perfect description of post-Reagan America.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, was stripping everything bare to its pure economic rationality, but on the other hand, constantly reviving
Yeah.
the family and tradition and back and forth in relation to each other. But I think, and here's where, and I do mention this in the conclusion of the book, the one place where I really talk about Deleuze and Guattari is where I think Deleuze and Guattari got things wrong is, or I would say not so much wrong, but maybe things have changed, that now what we see is not so much a coding on non-economic values and norms like the family, but a coding which falls directly on what is supposedly an axiom, right? That work itself becomes a value or norm, not just this stripped bare kind of like pure economic rationality, but as something which itself is supposed to give meaning and so on. I mean, and this ties into one of the things I find interesting in some of the more sociological analyses of work is, and I think James McCollum in his book Worked Over draws this correlation, that during the exact period in which working hours were increasing in the US and work compensation was decreasing, right? The famous graph that everyone's seen a million times, which shows work productivity and pay sort of parallel through much of the 20th century and beginning to separate in the 70s. And then, by the time you get to Reagan, they're moving in different directions entirely. But one of the things that he adds onto that is you see an increased use of people talking about the meaningfulness of work, or how work is seen as something they do that they take pride in or seen as worthwhile, right? That the exact period in which the axioms, I won't say the axioms are unraveling, but the fundamental axiom has been transformed, right? Because, Deleuze and Guattari also talk about, I mean, their economic theory is one, which is kind of interesting, about how like a state can add more axioms to the relation. In some sense, that's their version of like unemployment insurance, Social Security, workers' compensation are just axioms added to the wage for work relation that sort of flesh it out. And then, or you can strip away the axioms in the sense of, and this is in some sense their understanding of a kind of neoliberal authoritarianism, which basically says, no, we're not going to give you it. You either work or you starve. And this is kind of an aside. Within that, one could say that it's not so much the axiom between wages and work is undermined, but the terms of the axiom are changed. Work doesn't get you what it used to get you. In that same period, what we see is that work takes on its own kind of coding, or its coding becomes more and more central. And this is where I think, like I said earlier, one of the things I'm trying to do, and I quoted that passage from Marx about the work relation being immediately significant. This is a way to get away from thinking of base as being quantifiable, material, and non-ideological, and superstructure being qualitative and ideological. And Deleuze and Guattari's axiom code thing is a variant of a base superstructure problem. And they're pretty clear about this, right? They do see themselves as kind of taking up Marx's more broader kind of cultural argument or Marx and Engels' broader argument in the Communist Manifesto, which is where you get those very kind of provocative lines about all is holy is profaned, all is solid melts into air, and the way in which capital is decoding everything. And as Marx and Engels say in that, everyone from a doctor to a priest becomes a simple wage labor. All the world's things become just another commodity. But I think Deleuze and Guattari are adding to that their point, which I think is an important point, that this constant decoding and making everything quantifiable produces its own sort of nostalgia for codes and this nostalgia for values, but they attach that primarily to extra economic things, the family, traditions, etc. And what I want to argue is it seems like now we need to think about the way in which the economy itself can become ideological or coded in moral terms, that work itself is seen as something which gives one value, or more importantly, I think, if you really want to be clear about this, the hierarchy is the highest thing one can do is be a quote unquote job creator, right? A creator and maker of work, who's themselves seen as kind of a worker, right? Because one of the other things that's happened, I think, is very interesting culturally, is the redefinition of the capitalist as kind of the ultimate worker,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
The entrepreneur is,
yeah,
yeah.
an entrepreneur themselves, a complete recoding of the work capital relation, which is no longer work is seen as something opposed to capital or opposed to capitalist, but work is seen as the embodiment of the capitalist as worker and the worker themselves as a kind of capitalist on their or an investor in their own human capital.
That was very well said. I'm really glad you went in the weeds there, and I think that you're right. There is something about the economic or just work itself taking on a ground of reterritorialization for these codes, and bringing in Reagan as just kind of symbolic of this shift definitely, I think, paints that picture. And it's interesting, right? Because 1980 is A Thousand Plateaus, and right after that, I mean, immediately after, it's this new era, so to speak, even if it were sort of on the rise, but it catapults. And so, yeah, you're right. There is a sense in which that type of era ushers in a new, well, we could say a new relation between that ethic, that renewed ethic, which is interesting to think about. As you said, there's almost to cover the gap between the productivity and the wages. There is this renewed sense of self-dignity and work and all of this, right? Which I think best exemplifies that affective dimension, which is part and parcel of the ideological dimension that you're looking at. No, that was great. And I really appreciate you going into that. I know we've had you for about an hour and a half. I want to leave space, Coop, if you had something to add. I know I could probably pull from one or more of the questions, and I do want to give you space, Jason, to talk about what you are working on and we can see from you in the future. Coop, if you want, I'll give you space, because I know I tend to be the monopoly man over here with my my hat and cane.
I mean, I guess I'll just mention that, just going back to Stirner and how I just think he's kind of haunts this discussion to some degree, is the fact that when you were discussing in the book the notion of abstract labor and its relation to abstract humanity, because I think this is Stirner's big critique, right? Is like, oh, these ideas, these real abstractions become like they control you, and there's no real materiality to them, so to speak. But again, the Marx corollary to that is like, I think his example is something like, oh, if you were drowning, if you could just imagine air, you would be saved, right? But I still think that, I believe that actually it was Engels writes a letter to Marx and is like, because he reads The Unique and Its Property, and he's kind of like, maybe with some reservations, perhaps, thinking that this is an important work that Marx needs to look into, so to speak. And then Marx, of course, returns with the German ideology, and we all know Stirner kind of gets shelved as this, like, discredited as this sort of bourgeois individualist, even though I think his critique is not quite so, like, I don't think should dismiss it quite so quickly, because I think it does have shades of both, I guess Foucault and maybe even Althusser, just in this way that, I mean, even just like property relations for Stirner, it would be like private property is simply an abstraction that is backed up by force. It's not real. If people were true egoists, if they were really seeking their personal benefit, their individual benefit, they would steal, they would riot, they would. I just thought that was a really interesting, I don't know. And then for the Marx side of things, and then on like the Spinoza side of things, something like Stirner's notion of the union of egoists. This would be a way. So this is where I see a connection in that. For Spinoza, it's about like, we increase our power to act, we increase our power and potency by making connections with others. And I think that the union of egoists is a perfect example of that. And it's also this immanent organizational structure that's not, it has a death drive. Like, it's not this permanent organization that sort of takes on this zombie characteristics and sort of hangs around and becomes an oppressive force or something like that. But again, I don't know if this generates any discussion on your end, but these are just little connections that I made.
I hadn't thought about it in this way, but I think one of the things is interesting, and one of the things I do talk about in the book is, Marx has this it's in the Capital One, it's in the section on commodity fetishism, where he talks about how a society of abstract labor is going to produce the idea of abstract humanity, right? And he even connects this with Christianity and more specifically deism, a religion of abstract man. This is one of those moments where, I know we talked at the beginning about Marx and philosophy, and one of those moments where I'm tempted to conclude, as Etienne Balibar does in his little book on Marx, that sometimes Marx, in places like Capital, he says he's constantly going beyond and falling short of a philosophical articulation, and that he's going beyond and that he's putting into question the entire sort of enterprise of philosophy. And this is what people like Alfred Sohn-Radel pick up on, that like, if you think of philosophy as being like abstraction comes from thought, part of what Marx is saying is no, abstraction actually comes from practices, not from thought, that it's commodity production, or more specifically, it's wage labor or labor power as a commodity that produces abstract and interchangeable humanity, not our ideas about humanity. So that's the going beyond. But there's also a kind of falling short in that Marx just kind of throws out this provocative thing where it's really a kind of short circuit or a kind of double shift on Marx's point. Like, you can go directly from the economy all the way to the sphere of religion and not having to pass through any of the mediations between, law, et cetera, et cetera. You can go straight from one to the other. I mean, maybe more of a short circuit than a double shift, like just boom, right one to the other. And, it's very provocative. But I also think that one of the things that I talk about in the book is that Marx, obviously, he says, and he says that this is one of his important theoretical discoveries, right? He says, like, I do not want to take credit for this connection between labor and value that's exists in Adam Smith, that exists prior to me. But the two things they didn't think about were the particular form that value takes, and he says the double nature side of labor, that it's not just that labor has to be both abstract and concrete, right? Abstract is, and of course, this is one of the hard concepts because it seems like an oxymoron. How can labor be abstract? But of course, as Marx points out, to some extent, it has to be, right? Because as he says, if labor wasn't abstract, then if it took me forever to make something, that would be its price, right? There has to be a sort of general standard productivity of labor for the entire economy to function. If worker X and worker Y took very different amount of time to produce something, we wouldn't have an economy in any possible sense of the word, right? We have to have interchangeable labor to have interchangeable commodities. But at the same time, labor is always going to be concrete. It's always going to be doing a specific thing. And to me, one of the things, this is here we get to these doubling upon doubles, right? There's a split of abstract and concrete labor, but I would argue there's also a split in which the way in which both the abstract and concrete can be understood in terms of their ethic and in terms of their alienation. In other words, what is the ethic of concrete labor? Well, it's the ethic of, like, I'm doing this particular thing, I'm good at this particular thing, I have pride and satisfaction in it. What is the alienation of concrete labor? The alienation of concrete labor is quite simply like, I'm doing this thing, but I don't want to just be this thing, right? I'm not just a waiter, to be Sartrean about it. I'm not just a waiter. I'm more than just a waiter. In fact, I want to act, and here's my 8x10 glossy. And then there's also, to some extent, an alienation of abstract labor. That's pretty clear because the standard of productivity is absolutely indifferent to my needs as a living, breathing thing. I mean, this is what Marx talks about this. But also you get this in interesting works of contemporary analysis, like, John Crary's 24/7, right? Work is indifferent to sleep. It's indifferent to time. It wants to turn us into maximum productivity. So there's alienation in that no one can do as much as work demands of them. And you get the bizarre cultural mutations of this, of like people in Silicon Valley trying to figure out if they can make the perfect smoothie drink so they don't have to stop to eat, lunch, like trying to embody abstract productivity. So there's the alienation. But I do think there's also, this is what, going back to Hegel a little bit, there is a kind of ethic of abstract labor in the sense of like, hey, I have a job. Hey, I'm part of society. I may not like the specific job, but I'm a productive member of society. And so one of the things I think that interests me, and this is another double shift of thinking the two sides of labor and the way in which both sides produce alienations and identifications that have different effects and different sort of demands behind them. And then the last thing I'll add to this, because I do think that in Spinoza too, there's a notion of abstract humanity. And this is something that Pierre Macheret really points out in his reading of the Ethics, is that there's a slight change in the Ethics where Spinoza, because Spinoza talks a lot about the imitation of affects, right? Like if someone likes something I like, it's going to make me like it more because I feel like I'm not alone in this. And I'm also going to kind of like them because I feel like we have something in common. But one of the things that the slippage that Pierre Macheret picks up in his reading of Spinoza is that at some point in Spinoza's discussion of this imitation of affects, he shifts from it being a specific person to just being like an image of humanity, right? We have an image of humanity underlying our actions. Like, in other words, we think of ourselves as doing what people do, not just what a specific person does. That image, I think, for Spinoza is very ambivalent. And I would argue that its ambivalence can be seen in the way in which our ideas about a general human norm can sometimes have very pernicious effects, in that, for example, the norm of productivity is one that excludes and seeks to exclude all sorts of people who are not seen as necessarily productive enough. Because, of course, one of the other things that Spinoza says about ideas about abstract humanity is that as a universal, it's always tainted by a particular, right? If I say humanity to you, as Spinoza says, that one person's going to think a political animal, one person's going to think a flightless biped, etc. We all have different images, and those images always taint the universal. And so that images of abstract humanity can be very pernicious. But I think at the same time, because Spinoza himself will say nothing is more useful to man than man, right? We need each other, that there's another, and I think, Balibar has kind of made the argument that this other humanity is a kind of almost and here I'm putting words in Balibar's mouth, going to make him sound more Deleuzian, a sort of humanity without an image. It's not a common something because it has to be different. On this point, Balibar is right, and he's right about Spinoza, that we are useful to each other insofar as we are different. And that difference is in some way kind of unrepresentable, right? It's not the image we have of humanity. And that's the more liberatory, and I think to some extent, here, I'm not going to get at the long point about like how concepts for Spinoza, the famous line, the concept dog doesn't bark. Concepts for Spinoza are non-representational, or not representational in a sort of figurative sort of way. They're more productive of effects, but that's a bigger point that would take more time.
Coop, before I let you speak, I was just glad that you, in what you were discussing just then, Jason, that you were able to bring in something like the notion of negative solidarity without us spending too much time on it. I know that would probably keep us for another hour or so, but I do think that part of the perniciousness you were talking about of these images and the exclusion and inclusion effects of negative solidarity are really important. And I know we didn't get to spend time on it today, but it would have been, I think you covered some of that. And Coop, I'm sorry for cutting you off.
Oh, no, it's fine. I just think you really highlighted something like Stirner's notion of the creative nothing, which defies representation to some degree. Just to go along with that, the title of the book is The Unique and Its Property. We don't have to necessarily focus on the property side, although that I think is maybe germane ultimately, but I don't know. I think specifically the unique one, right? That's where I see the connection, or that's the interesting little dialogue that I was kind of picking up on. So excellent for drawing that out of my kind of what I threw at you. So kudos to you there.
Well, Jason, we've had you here, and obviously I've been really enjoying our talk, learned a lot from what you're discussing. There's tons more to explore in the book. So I do want to obviously encourage the readers to check that out, and also to check out we'll have to link your other interview that I mentioned earlier. That's very short. It's probably a 5-minute read. And you do get to talk about negative solidarity, specifically there. As I said, we could probably unpack that for an hour or more. But in lieu of that, we're going to let you discuss or tell us about anything you're working on now, or anything that may be forthcoming already. You've had a productive couple of years since the pandemic. I say since as though it's over, but you understand it, since the beginning of the pandemic. So yeah, just maybe use this space to plug anything you're doing, including your blog, obviously, which we'll put all of this info in the show notes.
Speaking of the blog, I'm doing with Mayfly Books, I'm doing a book version of some of the highlight pieces from the blog. I mean, this is almost a vanity project. I'm excited to see it come out and be in print. And that's really the main thing I have coming out right now that I'm sort of finalizing over this summer, and sort of in the midst of it, tying into our previous conversation, I'm writing a introduction for it, just about what was at stake for me in this moment of blogging, and sort of thinking about philosophy and thinking about the attempt to kind of find new spaces for articulation of philosophy, because I do think that philosophy has sort of tied itself too much to the classroom to its detriment, and especially its detriment in that the classroom as it used to exist is unfortunately at risk of becoming a thing from the past. And I think philosophy is too important to identify with its university function, and needs to constantly seek new forms of articulation, new forms of expression that connect with and utilize the new possibilities for communication. So that's one of the other things I'm thinking about too.
Well, that's excellent. Isn't there like a published volume of like Mark Fisher's work where it's a lot of like his?
Oh, yes, huge. Okay, well, yeah.
So it would be maybe something like that. We'll have a.
Yes, not quite as big, but something like that.
And I've talked to Gil Morahone. He's translated some Spinoza adjacent works for the same series, I think, from Edinburgh University Press. So maybe at some point I will bug you once you have free time. We can think about maybe translating something together. I know if anyone's going to do that mammoth Matheron book, what is it, Individual and Community in Spinoza, that I think that will take a team of at least two. So maybe in the future we may be working together again. So
sure, sounds great.
If we consider what we did today work, right? That we can leave that up to the audience. But
yeah,
again, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to let you enjoy, hopefully, the rest of your Sunday, and we're going to stick on just for a minute to talk about, because I think next week, Coop, we got a free week, so we get to sort of do whatever we like, and it's good when we have guests to prepare for. Sometimes it's nice to just be able to again, this is maybe the spontaneity, just to do something random. But this episode will also be dropping in about 3 weeks. We'll be in touch between then, and I'll let you know, and you may see it. I'll probably tag you in Twitter when it releases. But if I don't talk to you until then, I look forward to speaking again in 3 weeks. And I just want to thank you again for your time and for your work.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. It always helps me kind of talk about things, helps me think about things, and it's a great thing to do. So, and a great podcast you guys provide. So I'm glad to be on.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye, Jason.
Once again, thanks to Jason Reed for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.